Okay, this is not your father's boiler. This is a field guide to piping up today's high-efficiency modulating condensing boilers. The boilers we're dealing with today are very, very different from the boilers of the past, of our youth. Those were old cast iron boilers, right? Those are boilers that looked an awful lot like that. And we could put our Dunkin' Donuts right on the boiler and sip at it while we're working on the burner, whether it's an oil burner or gas burner or whatever. And piping them up was pretty simple. You go out, you come back. You got a supply, you got a return. As long as you take care of some pretty simple basics on the Gazauta and on the Gazbacta side, you're looking pretty good. Kind of hard to screw up, very forgiving. And that was the way we installed boilers for decades, and it worked just fine. Starting in the 80s and going into the 90s, and then really coming on in the aughts, the new century, we started bringing on a brave new world. This brave new world looks kind of like this, all right? Modulating condensing, high-efficiency boilers that require a new kind of skill set for piping. They require a little bit of thought, and it requires us to think differently. We cannot pipe them up the way we piped up our old favorites. Now, some of these boilers are changing. Some of them are evolving. The manufacturers are making heat exchangers that have lower and lower pressure drops. And if you look into any of the installation manuals of the boilers in which the boilers that you are installing, you will find that they all provide you with options for boiler installation piping or boiler piping installation. You can pipe them up in a traditional in and out direct piping method, although they prefer and they recommend a different type of piping strategy, which we will discuss. Okay. What we're going to learn today is the right way to pipe those boilers up. We're going to learn the right way to pipe those boilers up. We're going to learn how to select the right pipe sizes, how to size your pipe on the boiler side, and how to size the pipe on the header and distribution side. We're going to get into the specifics on how that is done and why it is done the way in which it is done. We're also going to discuss how to select the right supply water temperature. What temperature do we need to supply to the system, but also what temperature do we need the boiler to fire to? They're not necessarily the same things, and that can create some issues. And we're finally going to wrap up with a quick review and discussion on the benefit of hydraulic separators and buffer tanks, what they do, what they don't do, and why you might want to consider them in your piping arrangement. There's two very good reasons for considering the use of these things in your piping arrangements, and we'll go over both of those. So let's get started on the manufacturer's preferred method of piping up a modulating condensing boiler. Every boiler manufacturer's literature that I've looked at over the past couple months to prepare for this all show what essentially is the same piping arrangement. The drawings in their manuals may look unique or a little different and at different angles and different isometrics or whatever, but when you peel all that away, the actual piping strategy for all of them is basically the same. It's what we call moose antler piping. Moose antler piping, and we call it moose antler piping. Well, just look at your screen and see what does it remind you of? Moose antlers, right? Moose antlers. Same thing, only different. These are moose antlers. You got the boiler's kind of like the face of the moose, and the header are the antlers, and the supply and return piping are the points on the antlers. It's moose antler piping, right? And this is people call this primary secondary, but it's kind of a variation on primary secondary, because the primary loop with a cast iron boiler, your primary loop starts in the Gazauta hole of the boiler, does a loop-de-loop, and goes and returns back to the return port on the boiler. So it's a direct supply to return loop-de-loop. And then your secondaries come off of that. This is kind of the same thing, only different in that which one's the primary? Now, people will often refer to the boiler loop as the primary because you got the Gazauta hole of the boiler going back to the Gazinda hole of the boiler. Okay, that makes some sense. I can certainly see that. But the bigger section is the distribution section. So some people have called that the primary part. I prefer to just be descriptive rather than talking primary, secondary. Just show what they are. I call it the boiler loop. That's pretty straightforward. That's the boiler loop. That's the pipe that's going in and out of the boiler and connecting to your header. And then there is the distribution loop. That's the distribution side of the system. You will note if you peer through the yellow, you'll see those two black dots. That's the connection point between the boiler loop and the distribution loop. What makes this quasi-primary secondary is the spacing of those two T's. No more than 6 inches or 4 pipe diameters is optimum. For the same reasons, no more than 6 inches or 4 pipe diameters on a traditional primary-secondary piping arrangement on a cast iron boiler. We want the pressure drop in the common piping, and that's the piping in between those two T's. We want the pressure drop in the common piping to be as minimal as possible. Does that make sense? Let me know, first off, let me know if that makes sense. Type in your response and let me know how the pace is. Are we going, we're about a few minutes into this, so I just want to make sure everybody's staying up, staying with us. Pace isn't too fast if we're all good. So just give me a little bit of feedback here. Excellent, good, good, good. Terrific, thank you, thank you. Just want to know that you're still alive out there. Anyway, that's what the closely spaced T's makes it primary, secondary. Now some manufacturers will say 12 inches is perfectly acceptable spacing between those two T's on the header, and that is absolutely fine. There's no problem with that at all. What I have found is the closer the better, really. Because if you say, well, you can go 12 inches, someone might go 16 or 17 and call it good enough. And the further apart they get, the more interplay there is between the flow through the boiler or the distribution loop and the flow through the boiler loop. So it starts to become a little bit more of a concern. Okay, so that's the primary secondary portion of the moose antler. Ryan O'Connell asked a good question. The indirect goes directly off of the boiler loop. Yes, if you were to pipe an indirect water heater, you'd go off of the supply and return on the boiler loop. What would happen is when you have domestic hot water priority, the boiler circulator will shut down, so we're not sending any water to the distribution loop, and the indirect circulator would take over, and all of the flow would be directed to the indirect. So excellent, good question, Ryan. Thanks, man. I hope that answered your question. Very good. Sizing the boiler piping on the boiler loop. This is really easy. You look at the instructions, it will tell you. All right, you look at the instructions. The boiler manufacturers will tell you what that size pipe should be for the different sizes of boiler that they sell. The top chart came right out of the HTP Elite Installation Guide. For every model up from the EL 80 up to the 220, they will tell you your supply and return piping from the boiler connecting to your header, to the distribution header, should be no less than 1 inch. All right, the 299 301 1.25 inches, the 399 1.5 inches. Triangle Tube Prestige from their installation manual, to ensure adequate flow rate through the Prestige Solo, maintain a minimum 1 inch diameter on system piping connecting to the boiler. That's to maintain a flow. Now, these boilers are very flow dependent in their operation. In order to scrub the heat exchanger, all right, in order to keep those things from bopping off on high limit all the time, you have to have a very specific flow rate through that heat exchanger. They will tell you what size pipe that should be. They'll also tell you what circulator should be used as the boiler circulator. In many cases, they will in fact ship it with the boiler. That's the boiler pump. That's the pump you use as the boiler circulator on the boiler loop, and that's one of those things that's really not negotiable. Okay, not negotiable. John Scove asked question: 6 feet of pipe or 6 inches on center T's. The spacing between those two T's, John, where the boiler loop connects to the header, no more than 6 inches or 4 pipe diameters. Okay. Ron Beck asked a really great question. What happens when the flow in the boiler is much greater than the flow in the indirect? Well, what's going to happen there is you're going to have they're going to tell you exactly what pump to use for your indirect as well, or you're going to have to figure that out. You're going to have to overcome the head loss not only of the, you're going to have first off, you're going to have the proper flow rate for the indirect. That's the first thing you have to figure out, and that will be fair. That will be a lot more than you think it will be. I'll tell you that. If you got to look up in your schematics or your specifications for the indirect, make sure you know the flow rate through the heat exchanger for the indirect to get the recovery you need. Size that pipe properly, and then you got to size your circulator to overcome the head loss through the heat exchanger, your supply and return piping, and the head loss in the boiler itself. So it's going to, when you do all that math, you'll find that you're going to need a fairly substantial circulator. Alrighty, let us continue. Header sizing. So we've done the boiler pipe sizing thing. It's follow the instructions. Now to size the header, the antler part of the moose antler piping. On the face of it, you would follow standard hydronic pipe sizing guidelines. All right, if the flow rate required for your distribution is 2 to 4 gallons per minute, 3/4 inch copper is fine. 4 to 9 gallons a minute, 1 inch copper is fine. 8 to 14, 1.25 inch, or 14 to 22 gallons per minute, 1.5 inch. And we simply do that by knowing the BTU load we're trying to deliver. We know the delta T to which we are designing, and we simply do the universal hydronics formula. GPM equals BTUH divided by the product of delta T times 500 if we're using 100% water. So let's say we have a system where we have to deliver 80,000 BTUs at a 20-degree delta T. 80,000 BTUs delivered to the system divided by 20 times 500 or 10,000, that would be a delivery flow rate of 8 gallons per minute. So judging by these guidelines, we're looking at 1 inch copper pipe. Now there's that overlap between 1 inch and 1.25 inch. We have 4 to 9 gallons per minute for 1 inch, 8 to 14 gallons per minute for 1.25 inch, and that's just the difference in inside diameter between Type M copper and Schedule 40 black iron. You may not be using Schedule 40 black iron on something like this, but because the Schedule 40 has a smaller ID, you're kind of limited to 8 gallons a minute on 1 inch black iron. You can go up to 9 gallons a minute on 3/4 inch Type M copper. So that explains the overlap. Okay. Now, a couple quick questions. Can you oversize the boiler loop? You got to keep pressure up in the boiler. When they say it should be a minimum of 1 inch, yeah, if you went up to 1.5 inches, I'm sure it would be okay. It wouldn't hurt anything. It wouldn't be a major issue. However, you don't want to get too oversized because the tappings on the boiler are going to be 1 inch anyway. Okay, so you don't really need to oversize. There's no benefit to oversizing the boiler loop. Now there may be a benefit to oversizing the header. Okay? There may be a benefit to oversizing the header. Real quick question, good question from Lyndon. Why does the pump push water into the boiler rather than pump away from it? I'm going to gather, Lyndon, that your question comes from the theory of pumping away. Pumping away as a theory has nothing to do with the boiler. It has to do with what we call the point of no pressure change, the spot where the expansion tank connects to the system. The reason the boiler on a modulating, the reason the circulator on a modulating condensing boiler is installed on the inlet so it pumps into the boiler's heat exchanger is because it is imperative, it is absolutely critical to keep the pressure up in the heat exchanger of that expansion tank. Every manufacturer's literature will show you the boiler circulator on the inlet pumping into the boiler. You want to keep the pressure up in that heat exchanger so that under high temperature conditions, like if it's making domestic hot water, we don't want the heat exchanger to get so hot so fast. We want to prevent that boiler from flashing to steam and bouncing around on the floor. So always, always, always pump into the boiler's heat exchanger on a modulating condensing boiler on the boiler loop. Now we'll pump away from the point of no pressure change on the header as we should, but on the boiler that's the way it really should be done because it's not a pumping away issue, it is a keeping the pressure up issue. Alrighty, short fat headers are good. We like short fat headers. The reason we like short fat headers is not because I'm a short fat guy, it's because we like short fat headers. Short fat headers help us with hydraulic separation. We want to make, chances are when you set up this system, the required or desired flow rate through the boiler loop is going to be very different and most likely less than the flow rate required through the distribution loop. Right? So in order to keep those two flow rates from interfering with each other, we want serious hydraulic isolation. So oversizing the header, if it says 1 inch, going up to 1.5 inches or even 2 inch can have benefit. Yes, it does add additional cost, but it keeps the two flows separate so they do not interfere with one another. We slow the velocity of the fluid, and at that point the boiler doesn't feel any of the zone calls for heat, and the zones don't feel the boiler circulation. In addition, if this is a retrofit boiler or a replacement boiler on an old system where you have a lot of cast iron radiators or baseboards and things like that, where after you've drained the system there's a lot of rust and crud and crap in there, another benefit of a short fat header installed in this manner, we call this the charging moose. Short fat header installed vertically. By oversizing that header, what we're going to do is slow the velocity of the fluid through the header way, way, way down to less than 2 feet per second. We're going to really drop the velocity way down so that when the water comes back from the zones into the header, the crud and junk and rust and crap that's in the water coming back from the system will drop down into that drip leg that you see, and you can actually drain it out. So it becomes kind of a dirt trap to keep that crud out of the heat exchanger of the boiler, and that's pretty important stuff. Okay, excellent, excellent, excellent. Let's go. Let me grab a couple questions here. Let's grab a couple of questions because we've got a bunch of them here, and this is really good. This is really good stuff. Julio asks, what is the recommended speed in feet per second? Does it apply to residential systems or only hydronic? If I'm understanding your question, Julio, typically when we're talking about velocities, the reason those pipe sizes are what they are, those pipe sizes are for have a minimum of 2 feet per second and a maximum of 4 feet per second. Those are that's the minimum and maximum fluid velocities. Any more than 4 feet per second, you run the risk of velocity noise. Less than 2 feet per second, dissolved gases want to come out of solution and you have air issues. Another reason why we have that short fat header, the velocity slows down, air bubbles will go up to the top and then go out an air vent. Doesn't necessarily replace an air separator, but it's a good thing to have. Okay. Can you give that GPM formula again? Sure can, John. GPM equals BTUH divided by delta T times 500. And what is the maximum BTUH capacity of the boiler for these pipe sizes and at what delta T? Dan, that's $1 million question, and to find that answer, I would recommend looking at the specification sheet for each manufacturer. They will give you, based on they will give you the pipe sizing and flow rates through the boiler at specific delta T's for each model, and then you can select which one you need for that application. I hope that answers your question. Very good, very good. Boy, we got a lot of them here. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Great, great, great. What are the effects of an oversized boiler circulator? Effects of an oversized boiler circulator, it's going to be really, really hard to maintain the delta T across the heat exchanger that you want, and that boiler's going to short cycle a lot, Tom. And it's going to, the more it short cycles, the more we wear stuff out, the more it short cycles. Overall, the less efficient and less economic that boiler is. So you don't want to oversize that circulator. Always do what they say to do. Okay, very good, very good. Let us continue. Now this is a water temperature problem because now we have to figure out, we've got the piping. Once we understand why we're doing it this way, the mechanics of putting this together, very, very easy. However, once we do put this together, we do have issues with water temperature. We want to make sure we have the water temperature that we need delivered to the heating system. Okay, here's an example. Let's say I have an 80,000 BTU load system. All right, the heating load is 80,000 BTUs under design conditions when it's 0 degrees outside. If I apply my universal hydronics formula, I find that my gallons per minute will be equal to 80,000 BTUs divided by my designed for delta T of 20 degrees, 20 times 500 or 10,000. 80,000 divided by 10,000, that is a header load of 8 gallons per minute. So my header down here has to be sized to deliver 8 gallons per minute. All right? In a normal world, that would be 1-inch pipe. In the world of ModCons, it might behoove us to, go up to 1.25 inches, even 1.5 inches. Okay? So 8 gallons a minute, and we've done our design calculations, and we have found that the boiler, that the system will require 140-degree water. Let's say I'm using panel radiators, and I've sized everything for 140-degree water. Okay? So 8 gallons a minute at 140 degrees. On the return side, since I have a 20-degree delta T, it's 8 gallons a minute. My flow rate's still the same, but the return water temperature will be 120 degrees under design conditions. For a modulating condensing boiler, this rocks because 120 degrees, we're going to condense almost all the time. This is good stuff. This is good stuff. Now, if I were to look at this, I have to figure out now what supply water temperature should the boiler be making. What do I have to set that boiler's target temperature under design conditions for? I'll tell you right now, it's not going to be 140, because if I have this boiler make 140-degree water, I don't think it's going to work real good, as we will see. But that's the question I have for you. What water temperature should the boiler be making? Well, there's a couple ways to figure this out. I'm going to show you the hard way, then I'll show you kind of a shortcut on how to do it. Let's take a look. 0-degree day, 8 gallons per minute, 140 going out, 8 gallons per minute, 120 coming back. I check my specifications, okay, for the boiler, and I find that the required boiler flow rate is 5 gallons per minute. All right, the required boiler flow rate that I need to pump through here is 5 gallons per minute. So what does that mean? We fill in some more blanks, okay? At 5 gallons per minute, understand how these things work, how closely spaced T's work. I have 8 gallons per minute zipping across this return leg right here, okay? Zipping across this return leg. At this T right here, with the boiler circulator operating at a rate of 5 gallons per minute, I will now have 5 gallons of 120-degree water leaving my header going into the boiler to be reheated. So I have 8 coming back, 5 going to the boiler. The question now is, how many gallons per minute of 120-degree water do I have going between those two T's, which is the common piping? How many gallons per minute? Well, that's math. If I've got 8 going into one end of the T, I'm yanking 5 out, I got to have 3 gallons per minute coming out the other end. Simple rule, what goes into a T has to come out of a T through a combination of the two holes, okay? So I've got 8 gallons a minute entering the T, 5 gallons a minute going to the boiler, 3 gallons a minute of 120 proceeding through the common piping into that second T, which is now a mix point, all right? I've got 5 gallons a minute going to the boiler, it's being heated up, 5 gallons a minute's coming out of the supply line, and that 5 gallons a minute of something is going to mix with 3 gallons a minute of 120, hopefully to give me 8 gallons a minute worth of 140 degrees. What should that be? Well, we can guess. We can say, yeah, 180, 140. Let's call it 140, 120. Let's call it 160. We'll call it 160. You know, you'd probably be fine. You'd probably be fine at 160. But let's see if we can't. You know, we're charging an awful lot of money here. Why don't we see what it is, what it really should be, so we can give this customer the maximum benefit of this high-efficiency boiler? Okay. The way to figure this out is we have to understand a simple algebraic formula that really we probably mastered by 8th or 9th grade, and it's A plus B equals C. We have to identify A plus B equals C. Really what the formula is FA times TA plus FB times TB equals FC times TC. How about that? FA times TA plus FB times TB equals FC times TC. Well, we have to identify A, B, and C, right? Well, it's really simple. This is our header return. This is the boiler gazinta, and this is the boiler gazouta, all right? This is the inlet to the boiler. This is the heated water coming out. Well, I want to figure out what my water temperature is going to the system. So this has got to be one of the things. This has got to be C, actually. This is a simple three-way mixing formula, all right? The common piping, the flow and temperature in the common piping is A. Flow and temperature in the boiler supply is B. And then flow and temperature in the header supply is C. So I'm mixing my flow and temperature in A with the flow and temperature in B to get the desired flow and temperature in C. F is flow, T is temperature. Let's fill in some blanks. The flow through A, as we recall from our last picture, was 3 gallons per minute. And the temperature was 120 degrees. The flow through B, which is coming out of the boiler, mixing in with that 120 degree water, it's 5 gallons per minute, but we don't know the temperature. That's what we have to solve for. And then the flow and temperature in C, which is being distributed out to the heating system, that is 8 gallons a minute, 140 degree water. So let's just math this out and just simplify and see where we're at. 3 times 120 is 360. 5 times we don't know is 5x, because we don't know x. We're trying to solve for x. And 8 times 140 is 1,120. To isolate x, the first thing we'll do is subtract 360 from both sides, and that'll be 5x equals 760. Now to solve for x, we simply, again, simple algebra, divide both sides by 5, and we come up with 152 degree water. Now, could we have guessed at that? Yeah. You might have guessed high, you might have guessed low, but it's really good. It's always good to know, isn't it? It's always good to know. So what we'll wind up doing is we will set the boiler's target temperature under design conditions to anywhere between 152 and 155 degrees for heating. You know, 155 might give you a little bit of safety, a little bit of extra. Okay? Now that's the hard way to do it. There is an easier way to do it, provided that the manufacturer gives you the information that you need in the manual. All right? This is a manual from Lochinvar, and what you do is you check the manual and you look up the model boiler that you're going to be installing. Let's say it's the Model 85, and then you look at the different charts and you find the temperature rise that you're targeting. What's the temperature rise across the boiler that you're targeting? The delta T across the boiler that you're targeting. Again, they'll give you charts for 20, 25, 30, 35. Here we're using the 35 degree temperature rise chart. So here we know the flow rate is 5 gallons a minute across the boiler. We know the minimum pipe size is 1 inch. Okay? So we find that information. Then we figure out what our return water temperature from the system is going to be under design conditions at that 20 degree delta T. In this case, we're going out at 140. We're coming back at 120. Well, then just add them up. All right? Add the manual's temperature rise, 35 degrees, to the 120, and we get, ta-da, 155 degrees. That's a little bit easier than doing all the math, but at least you know where those numbers come from and what happens at the boiler. Okay, a couple quick questions here. Let's see. This is from Troy. You may have answered this, but I can't stretch out my GPM by playing with my delta, and most mod cons come with a constant speed pump. Should I use a Bumblebee as a boiler pump? I'm going to say you probably shouldn't. I would say you should use what the boiler manufacturer tells you to do. When you start playing games out in the field and something happens, not a good thing. With some of the larger boilers, they are starting to look at variable speed circulators as the boiler pump on some of the larger ones. In fact, Lochinvar had a whole section on delta T, using a delta T type of control on the boiler itself to vary the speed of a circulator. They look for a circulator with a 0 to 10 input. On commercial bigger boilers, that is a school of thought. Some people prefer to say, hey, I don't care what happens, you got to scrub the heat exchanger and keep flow up and going. Different schools of thought. What does your boiler manufacturer say really in this case is what you should do, because they have the final say. All right, from Dan, GPM flow in the boiler and distribution flow should be the same. If distribution GPM is higher than the boiler loop GPM, then recirculation will take place. I think as we see here, Dan, not necessarily. Again, this is why we want the big fat header. What you just explained there, Dan, is why hydraulic isolation in mod cons is so critically important. Absolutely critically important. We could size that header to 1 inch, and I think a lot of what you say would probably happen in the Boilermaker short cycle. The bigger we make that header, the less likely that is to happen, to the point that if we go to a hydraulic separator or even a buffer tank, those problems virtually disappear. So I absolutely understand what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, but there's a reason why we do it, why we try to do it the other way, so that doesn't happen. Okay. Very good, very good. Let us take a look here. Another question from Thomas Galani. What is the temperature that you make the most condensate at? More condensate, more efficient? Yeah. The lower the return water temperature, the more that boiler is going to condense. I think you start condensing at about 100 at sea level. I think it's about 128 degrees return water. If I'm wrong on that, someone chime in. But I believe it's 128 degree return water temperature at sea level. That's when you start the condensing process. And the lower the return water temperature, the more that sucker's going to condense. All right, and the more you want it to condense. Okay. And we hear from Anthony Reichow, who is maybe one of the 2 or 3 smartest people I know. You can't be the smartest guy I know, Anthony, because that's Bruce Marshall. He's there. You may be number 2. The boiler needs to control the pump speed. So Anthony, is a ModCon boiler salesman and a ModCon boiler rep, is very, very adamant about that. System flow always needs to be greater than boiler flow. All right. Very good. Very good. All right. Now, here is a common mistake. I want to share this with you guys. This is a very common mistake we see out here. If you set the boiler to make 140 degree water, because that's what you need, and you pipe it up in this manner, if we look at the math, again, we have 8 gallons of 120 degree water coming back, 5 gallons of 120 are going into the boiler, 5 gallons of 140 are coming out, mixing with 3 gallons of 120. Really what we're going to have is 8 gallons of 133. And under design conditions, that's probably not going to get her done. That's probably not going to get her done. Very common mistake. So again, you got to go through the math here, guys, to figure out your boiler, what temperature you need the boiler to fire to, right? What temperature you need the boiler to fire to. And then again, the more hydraulic isolation you have here, the better off you're going to be. The better off you're going to be. Alrighty. A lot of folks, we see this happening a lot. A lot of guys are designing, because it's a low temperature boiler, we see an awful lot of system designs out there that are designed around one water temperature. I have one water temperature for everything. The boiler can go low. It's simple. It makes it very simple. And I like simple. But sometimes we don't want to go so simple that it becomes simplistic. There's a difference between simple and simplistic. Let's say you have a job where you have some panel radiators, you have some high temperature radiant floor heating in between the floor joists, and then you have some radiant floor heating in the slab. At that point, mixing with a modulating condensing boiler is going to make some sense. And in fact, it's actually going to have some substantial benefits. Here we show the header. We see those 4 circulators down on the red side that are distributing heat to panel radiator zones. Let's say those are at 150 degrees. And then we have our radiant floor heating in between the floor joists and our radiant floor heating in the slab, 2 separate water temperatures. If the radiant floor heating in between the floor joists needs 130 degrees, well, if we use a mixing device of some kind to get down to 130 degrees under design conditions, well, we'd simply set up, in this case, a 3-way motorized mixing valve like you see here. And then our basement slab maybe needs 110 degrees under design conditions. We can set up a second mixing station there. Now, the benefit of doing this, especially if you use something like the I valve, you use a tempering valve or a mixing valve, but a Taco I valve is a motorized mixing valve, and you have outdoor reset built into those little green heads on each one of those. So not only do we have boiler reset for the high temperature stuff, we also have system delivery reset, outdoor reset for the high temperature radiant, so it'll be 135 on the coldest day of the year. But as it gets warmer out, that temperature will drop, okay, based on outdoor reset, and we'll have 110 on the coldest day of the year for the radiant slab. But as it gets warmer out, that temperature will drop as well through the control on each head. So I'd have outdoor reset for the boiler, outdoor reset for each of my radiant delivery packages. The benefit to this is when each radiant runs, we're sending back cooler and cooler water than the boiler would get otherwise, so the boiler is going to condense even more and behave more efficiently. So you get the lowest possible return water temperatures in those situations. So again, there's a lot to like about using the low water temperature capabilities of a ModCon and designing around one low water temperature. But there may be instances where you may be able to employ some mixing with outdoor reset using an I valve from Taco that will add to the overall efficiency of the system. And also, you're not going to want to send 150-degree water into the radiant slab. That's just not going to work. So again, think these things through, look at the application, and see what makes sense. A couple comments from Mr. House, who's also one of the 2 or 3 smartest people I know up in Toronto. Some boilers have a system sensor which goes downstream of the tees, and the boiler will automatically adjust supply temperature regardless of flow rate as the boiler flow rate is fixed. Okay, well, that's a good thing. And these things are very, very smart. And different boiler manufacturers have really, they stepped up and have come up with very different strategies and different ways of doing things. So they're very they're kind of useful. Obviously, read the instructions because they have capabilities that may be unique to them. They all kind of do the same thing. They make water warm or make water hot, but they might go through it in different ways. So always read the instructions and make your selections carefully because there's some interesting stuff out there. Amir asks, what does FT/HD mean on the chart? Feet of head. How many feet of head loss through the heat exchanger when we're talking about boilers? That's what that means, Amir. Let me know if that answers your question. Frank Taverna, how you doing, Frank? Glad you're here. I have some contractors who use the reset control of the boiler to set system temperature on radiant systems. If I have a multi-zone radiant system with only one zone operating, will I overheat the radiant panel? That's a great question, Frank, and there's no short answer. The shortest answer is it depends. How well zoned is it? If it's zoned very, very well, no, you probably won't overheat the radiant panel. It'll just shut off when the zone's happy, and that's it. You can't overheat it. A floor can't get warm enough to satisfy the thermostat and then get warmer. That part doesn't work. If it's an aggressive zoning package, yeah, I think what you have there is fine. If they said, well, we're going to try and put all these rooms on one zone and the thermostat's in the hallway, well, some rooms are going to get too hot, some rooms are going to get too cold, and some rooms are going to be just right. It's like living with the 3 bears, you know. So what you're describing works okay if there's an aggressive zoning package. Okay. Wouldn't Ryan O'Connell, wouldn't you supply the lower temp branches last after the high temp and then return them first? If you're referring, Ryan, to the picture here, probably. I kind of drew that on the quick. So yeah, there may be there may be a pattern here to supply these. You take off your supplies and returns that might be more beneficial with a loop system, primary, secondary, like on a cast iron boiler. You always take the highest temperature ones off first and the lowest ones off last. In this type of a piping arrangement, a moose antler piping arrangement, it is my belief that it's not as critical. Okay, it's because we're not doing any mixing on the primary. You take the hottest stuff first on a traditional cast iron boiler primary loop because you will have cascading water temperatures because you're going out, returning 6 inches later. You're going out, returning 6 inches later. After each secondary, the water temperature cascades down in the primary. In this case, we're returning to the other side of the moose antler, to the alternate antler, so to speak. That cascading isn't going to happen, if I'm understanding your question correctly, Ryan. So I think it's less critical in this type of an arrangement. Alrighty, these slides came to me from my good friend Anthony, and I want to share them with you because Anthony's a pretty smart guy. Anthony's a pretty smart guy. Some condensing basics. And this is a lot, I've heard this so often over the years. If you have a fin tube baseboard system and you have to run 180-degree water, it's just silly to put in a ModCon boiler. It's a waste. It'll never condense. It's going to run up to 180 degrees. It's not going to be efficient. It's a waste of money. You're better off with a cast iron boiler. Well, yeah, they're different schools of thought. Anthony sent me these slides, and I'd like to share them with you. And Anthony, just send me a note if I get anything wrong here. This is if we set up an appropriate outdoor reset curve, what you have here is a temperature curve for this particular boiler, a ModCon boiler installed with a baseboard system designed for 180-degree supply water temperature on the coldest day of the year. In this example, it will condense anytime the outdoor temperature reaches above 40 degrees, assuming the system is sized properly. Again, just follow over here on the left you have water temperatures, okay? Down at the bottom you have outdoor temperatures, and you see as the temperature goes up, as the temperature gets warmer, the boiler temperature will decrease until we reach the condensing point right here. That's the return water temperature condensing point. We reach the condensing point right here. Anytime it's warmer than, let's say, 40 degrees out, that boiler will condense. Now, how much of the time will that? If you look at it here, it doesn't look like a whole lot of time. But let's take a look at how much time each heating season we spend at specific outdoor temperatures. We all know we panic and the world goes crazy when we're at or near design conditions. They're on the news saying Armageddon is coming, we're all going to freeze to death, you know, get to the grocery store, get water and toilet paper because we don't know what's going to happen, right? It happened all the time this winter. But how much time do we really spend there? Well, this next slide kind of shows us. And this comes from what Anthony provided here is ASHRAE degree day data for central Massachusetts. But this really does apply through most of the cold weather parts of the U.S. The outdoor temperature, you know, bottom end may change compared to, you know, northern Minnesota to central Massachusetts to Philadelphia to northern California. But the percentages are fairly consistent. If we take a look at this, you'll see the outdoor temperatures down below, and the percentages are the amount of time you spend in those temperature ranges. 0 or below, less than 1% of the heating season. You know, 0 up to, say, it looks like about 10 or 12, maybe 2%, then 3%, 9%, 22% of the heating season, a big healthy chunk, is spent between what looks to be about 28 and 41 degrees. Okay, that's the bulk of the heating season. Again, the numbers may change depending on where you are, but the percentages will stay about the same. Then we go to the condensing mode, 21%, 21%, 22%. If you take a look at this, we are in the condensing mode 64% of the time, the non-condensing mode 36% of the time. This is with fin tube baseboard, boiler firing up to 180 degrees with outdoor reset. That to me makes a very, very bold statement about how applicable a ModCon boiler would be in a fin tube baseboard retrofit application. I think that's kind of neat. Is it efficient? Well, yeah. Boiler efficiency is a function of outdoor temperature. Here we see the different relative efficiencies based on the return water temperatures going back to the boiler. And what we come up here with is an average seasonal efficiency of about 93%. Again, the colder it is outside, the less efficient it is. The warmer it is outside, the more efficient it is. And that's going to be true of a ModCon boiler in any installation. Wow, that's kind of cool. How about that, Anthony? That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. My dogs are all excited today, aren't they? Can you hear them? They are all excited. I'm not quite sure what's going on up there. All righty. Cool. Let's talk about hydraulic separators now. We talked about hydraulic isolation and the importance of it. And we had a question earlier that beautifully illustrated why hydraulic isolation is so critically important. The distribution flow rate will very often, if not always, be greater than the boiler flow rate. How are we going to keep those two from messing with each other? Short fat headers is one way. Building your own short fat header is a very, very good way of doing it. A hydraulic separator, and we've seen them all over the place, a hydraulic separator is really nothing more than a prefabricated short fat header, if you want to look at it that way. It's just a short fat header that has been made for you. You could build it, or you could buy one and bang it on the wall and save time. Your call, your call. Really what you're doing here is primary, secondary, without a primary circulator or a primary loop, so to speak. These will have an air vent up at the top, a little dirt trap down at the bottom for the reasons we discussed earlier. Okay? And when you use it with a ModCon boiler, it helps maintain the proper flow through the boiler, as we said. Mixing takes place in here, as it does in those closely spaced seas, but of course it's not a mixing device. And it isolates the two. So flow through here is not going to interfere with flow through the boiler. And flow through the boiler is not going to interfere with flow through the distribution system. Okay? It does also add a little bit of mass to the system, a little bit of water content, depending upon which ones you buy. And that's also very important with ModCon boilers. We don't want to promote short cycling. We want to do everything we can to alleviate the short cycling problem. So the more mass, the more water that's in a hydraulic separator, the better off we're going to be. Now, the ultimate hydraulic separator, here's what it looks like. We could simply build this. This is what we're talking about. You could build this, all right? You could build this with your oversized header and build this whole thing right here, this whole setup right here, all right? This whole setup right here. You could build that in the field and size it appropriately, size it as needed. Or you could install this, meaning you could buy that thing, bang it on the wall, hook up your boiler, hook up your distribution, and call it a day. Your call. They're going to, if you oversize the header, they're going to do essentially the same thing. One, you bang on the wall and it's done for you. Another, you have to make yourself. Okay? But ultimately, sized properly, they'll both do about the same thing. Now, I want to get to a couple questions before we jump into expansion tanks, or not expansion tanks, buffer tanks rather. Ryan asks, wouldn't you supply the lower temp branches last after the high temp supply and then return them first? Again, if is with a cast iron boiler where the primary loop is in fact a loop that starts at the boiler outlet and goes all the way to the return, yeah, then you would have the hottest ones first, and then the lowest ones, and as they cascade down, the lower temperature outlets would be later on. In this type of an application with mixing, it's probably not all that. I may be wrong, but it doesn't appear to me to be that it would matter a whole heck of a lot. It's probably better to keep it simple and logical and straightforward. But in the big picture, I'm not sure it matters much because we're not returning our cold return water is not being returned into the supply water that's going to the next supply. If that makes sense. All right, another question. What about adding a bumblebee to pump those zones as well? Is that overkill at this point? No, not at all, Thomas. Your zone pumping, your zone valve pumping, anything that makes sense in your distribution in terms of a variable speed pump, a fixed speed pump, zone valve, circulators, etc. Whatever makes sense there still applies. It doesn't overkill. It doesn't change anything. In fact, putting a variable speed delta T circulator as your system pump for zone valve distribution is going to help this situation tremendously because since it's varying its speed to maintain that 20-degree delta T, you know you're always going to get a 20-degree delta T coming back, and you'll always have that lowest possible water temperature going back to the boiler. It's going to make it condense even more. So it's not overkill. I think it is an outstanding addition to enhance the efficiency of a boiler that we're already trying to make as efficient as possible. So I hope that answers your question, Thomas. I love questions like that. All righty. Couple of others. Let's see. Okay, this is getting hard to. Let's see. Here we go. James, Mr. House says RTFM. Read the free manual. Yes, the free manual that comes with you. Always read the free manual. Steve Jansen says, would it make sense to match the lowest boiler output to the minimum zone heat load? If you can. Again, it depends on the boiler. What you're talking about there, Steve, is we're going to get right into that on the minimum boiler, the lowest boiler output, and the minimum load zone. If one's bigger than the other, one's smaller than the other, how do we deal with it? What you're talking about is we're going to be making a case for buffer tanks in about 2 minutes. So good question. I'm glad you asked that. Okay. Very good. Very good. All right, couple more. Let's see. Stanley Barge. I would love to get a copy of this slide. Can you email those out to us, Stanley? There are going to be. We are going to we're recording this, and we will post a recording of this webinar as well as a PDF copy of the presentation on the neighborhood. And I know you're a member of the neighborhood. I'm pretty sure you're a member of the neighborhood, but you can go there and download this one and all the others. All right. Very good. Very good. Very good. So again, zones don't feel the boiler flow, and the boiler doesn't feel the zone flow, and that's the beauty of a hydraulic separator. Okay, you can either build it yourself, you got to build a big old fat header, or you could buy it, bang it on the wall, and be done with it. All right, now let's talk about buffer tanks because a lot of questions have come up that really lead us to the buffer tank, and this should carry us right up to the top of the hour. Buffer tanks are just big hydraulic separators. There's nothing remarkable or unusual or fancy about them. It's just a big old honking hydraulic separator. The one you're looking at here, that little itty bitty tank, also happens to be insulated. Okay, it's an insulated tank. It's just a big empty tank where we store water. We're adding water volume to the boiler to essentially help keep it from short cycling under milder conditions, and also help keep it from short cycling when it's really hot out or really cold out too. Short cycling kills ModCon boilers. It's one of those things. It's like a time bomb out there. The way we've piped them up traditionally, they're we are encouraging them to short cycle. And short cycling, it's never as efficient as it could or should be, and the more it short cycles, the faster we tend to wear out important components in the system, important expensive components in the system that are going to need to be replaced. So buffer tanks are just simply big hydraulic separators, but they pack a big wallop too. They help reduce short cycling, and as you can see here, it's just like a hydraulic separator. You got your boiler supply, boiler return. You got your system supply here, and your system return here. Works just fine. And the supplies and return, zone supply and returns, boiler supply and return. It's just a big old open space in the piping, big old tank, just like a hydraulic separator. Here's your schematic, again, where you have your, here's your expansion tank and air separator. On your distribution side, here are your heating circulators, your heating zones, if you're zoning with circulators. Over here we have the boiler and our boiler circulator on over here, as well as the indirect on the other side as well. Okay, so here's your basic piping schematic. It's the same thing for the same piping schematic for a hydraulic separator. Woof woof. I wonder what's going on up there, but something important. Alrighty. Now, how big should the tank be? What size tank should we have? Well, here's the math, okay? What you want to do, and this goes back to your minimum boiler firing rate, the question came up earlier. You want to find the minimum boiler firing rate, the lowest turn-down ratio of that boiler. Find the minimum boiler firing rate, and if that minimum boiler firing rate is larger than the BTU load of the smallest zone, then you should go ahead and follow up with this. Even if it isn't, a buffer tank's not going to hurt you any. But here it's absolutely essential. The minimum boiler firing rate minus the BTU load of the smallest zone gives you something called the BTU surplus. The BTU surplus. Right, minimum boiler firing rate minus the BTU load of the smallest zone is the BTU surplus. Next, multiply that BTU surplus by the desired minimum run time of the boiler. Every time it fires, you want it to fire for at least this long. And we usually use 10 minutes. So we have 10-minute burn cycles, nice long burn cycles. We want longer burn cycles, but fewer burn cycles, right? Minimum desired runtime, usually 10 minutes. So BTU surplus times your desired minimum runtime gives you something called the cycle factor, the cycle factor. Next, to find the size of the tank, we will divide the cycle factor by the distribution side delta T times 500. This will be 20 times 500, or whatever the distribution side delta T happens to be. So not the boiler delta T, but the heating system side delta T. So cycle factor divided by delta T times 500 will give you the tank capacity in gallons. Okay, that'll give you the tank capacity in gallons. So let's take a look. Let's do one. Okay, and again, these slides will be available for you on the Neighborhood. If you join the Neighborhood, you can download a PDF of this presentation as well as all the presentations we've had going back about 3 or 4 years. Okay, let's do an example. Let's say we have a 100,000 BTU ModCon boiler with a 4-to-1 turn-down ratio. That boiler with a 4-to-1 turn-down ratio will have a minimum firing rate of 25,000 BTUs. The load of the smallest zone under design conditions is 8,000 BTUs. Right? The load of the smallest zone is 8,000 BTUs. So, to get us started, we will subtract the BTU load of the smallest zone from the minimum firing rate. So 25,000 minus 8,000 will give us a BTU surplus of 17,000. So there's our BTU surplus, 17,000 BTUs is the surplus. Next, we're going to multiply 17,000 BTUs by our 10-minute cycle, our minimum desired 10-minute burn cycle. 17,000 times 10 gives us 170,000. Now, to find the size of the tank, we'll divide 170,000, the cycle factor, by the delivery side delta T times 500. So that's 170,000 divided by the delivery side delta T of 10,000, 20 times 500. All right, 170,000 divided by 10,000. That gives us a 17-gallon tank. So what we would need to do is find something as close as we can to a 17-gallon tank. Well, I can't find a 17-gallon tank. Okay, what can you find? I can find a 10-gallon tank. Okay, put in a 10-gallon tank. What would the net result be if you put in a 10-gallon tank instead of a 17-gallon tank? Well, your minimum burn cycle would probably be about 6 minutes instead of 10. It's better than 2. It's better than 30 seconds, right? It's better than 3 minutes. It's better. It's not as good as if it was a 17-gallon tank. If you can find a 20-gallon tank instead of a 17-gallon tank, well, you put in a 20-gallon tank. Worst thing that's going to happen there is your minimum run time might be 11 or 12 minutes. Not a bad thing. The thing we're trying to do is the bigger the tank, the better off we're going to be in terms of minimum run time. And you don't have to go crazy on the tank. Here, anything between a 15 and a 20-gallon tank is going to be just fine. It's going to be a heck of a lot better than not doing anything. Okay? That's the point we're trying to make here. So that'll do it for the presentation.